The greatest illusion of modern life isn't that we're free, it's that we believe we know what freedom actually means. We walk through life following invisible rules, burdened by moral constraints we never questioned, and haunted by the ghosts of beliefs we inherited but never chose. And at the center of this elaborate system of control stands a figure that has shaped Western civilization for millennia: God. This is where Friedrich Nietzsche, perhaps the most misunderstood philosopher of the modern era, enters our story with a declaration that shook the foundations of Western thought. God is dead. These three words have echoed through time, often stripped of their context, twisted beyond recognition. But today we're going to explore what Nietzsche truly meant by this proclamation, and why he saw the death of God not as a tragedy to mourn, but as humanity's only genuine path toward authentic freedom. When Nietzsche wrote that God is dead in his work, The Gay Science, he wasn't celebrating, nor was he simply making an atheistic claim about the non-existence of a divine being. No, he was diagnosing the condition of European civilization in the late 19th century. He was observing that the Enlightenment, scientific progress, and modernity had already undermined the foundation of religious authority that had given meaning and moral structure to Western civilization for centuries. The belief in God that once ordered society, justified morality, and gave purpose to suffering was collapsing under the weight of reason and scientific inquiry. But here's what most people miss. Nietzsche wasn't merely reporting a cultural shift. He was warning us about its profound consequences. God is dead, he wrote, and we have killed him. What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? For Nietzsche, the death of God meant the collapse of the entire metaphysical and moral order that had given Western civilization its coherence and direction. Without God, there was no longer any objective source of meaning, value, or morality. The universe had suddenly become cold, indifferent, and purposeless. Humanity stood alone, facing the abyss of cosmic insignificance. Most of us, Nietzsche observed, weren't ready for this reality. We continue living as if nothing has changed, clinging to the moral frameworks and values derived from Christianity, even while abandoning its theological foundations. We've kept the structure but removed its cornerstone, creating a house destined to collapse. This is what Nietzsche called the shadows of God. We killed God but continue to worship at empty altars, following rules with no ruler, obeying commands with no commander. You feel this contradiction in your daily life, don't you? The lingering sense that things should matter objectively, that certain actions are inherently right or wrong, that human life has intrinsic value and dignity. All these intuitions are remnants of a worldview that placed God at its center. Yet simultaneously, you live in a world increasingly explained by science, governed by secular institutions, and defined by individual choice rather than divine command. This tension isn't just philosophical, it's existential. It manifests as the creeping nihilism that haunts our age, the suspicion that nothing truly matters, that all values are arbitrary, that existence itself might be meaningless. Depression, anxiety, addiction, the desperate search for purpose through consumption, achievement, or fleeting pleasures. These are all symptoms of what happens when a civilization loses its metaphysical anchor without developing a new source of meaning. But Nietzsche wasn't a prophet of despair. Far from it. He saw the death of God as both our greatest crisis and our greatest opportunity. The collapse of divine authority wasn't just an end, it was a beginning. It was the necessary prerequisite for humanity's true liberation. Think about what it means to live under the gaze of an all-knowing, all-judging deity who has predetermined what is good and evil, who demands certain behaviors and prohibits others, who promises eternal reward or punishment based on compliance with his commands. Is this freedom? Or is it the ultimate form of subjugation, a cosmic dictatorship that extends even into your private thoughts? Traditional religious morality doesn't just constrain your actions, it colonizes your consciousness. It teaches you to judge yourself through alien eyes, to feel guilty about natural impulses, to deny aspects of your humanity that don't conform to divine decree. It splits you into warring factions, the higher self that obeys God's law versus the lower self of instinct, desire, and will. This internal division, this self-alienation, is what Nietzsche recognized as the true prison, not just religious institutions, but the God concept that had been internalized within the Western psyche. The death of God means the possibility of your rebirth, not as a creature made in someone else's image, but as the creator of your own values, the author of your own meaning, the sculptor of your own character. This is what Nietzsche called becoming who you are, the project of authentic selfhood freed from external authorities that would define your nature and purpose for you. But let's be clear, this freedom is terrifying. It's far easier to follow a predetermined path, to outsource your moral responsibility to tradition or divine command, to be told what your life should mean rather than creating that meaning yourself. Freedom isn't just a release from constraints. It's an overwhelming burden of responsibility. When God dies, the weight of existence falls entirely on your shoulders. This is why Nietzsche described the death of God as both the greatest recent event and a catastrophe that humans were not yet ready to fully comprehend. He knew that most people would retreat from this radical freedom, seeking new masters, new absolutes, new forms of escape from the vertigo of cosmic orphanhood. And hasn't history proven him right? Look at the 20th century, the age that fully inhabited the death of God. What did we do with our newfound freedom? We created new absolutes, new idols: the state, the race, the party, the market, science, technology, progress, totalitarianism, world wars, environmental destruction, consumer capitalism. These weren't aberrations, but predictable consequences of a humanity desperate to fill the void left by God's absence. Nietzsche foresaw all this. He knew that the initial response to God's death would not be liberation, but new forms of bondage. He watched as his contemporaries replaced faith in God with faith in progress, nationalism, socialism, or scientific materialism, trading one dogma for another, one form of conformity for another. This is why he introduced the concept of the last man, his term for the diminished human being who emerges from the death of God without embracing the full implications of that death. The last man no longer believes in heaven but makes comfort his God instead. He no longer fears divine judgment but lives in terror of social disapproval. He no longer worships a deity but makes an idol of security, convenience, entertainment, and social status. The last man says, "We have discovered happiness," and blinks. He reduces life to the pursuit of comfort and the avoidance of suffering. He wants neither great loves nor great stars. He makes everything small, including himself. The last man is humanity shrinking from its own potential, choosing the narcotic of consumer comforts over the dangerous adventure of creating new values. Does this sound familiar? Look around you. Look within yourself. How much of your life is spent pursuing what Nietzsche would call small happiness? Comfort, security, pleasant diversions, social validation. How often do you measure your worth by standards you've never questioned? How frequently do you choose what is safe over what is true to your deepest nature? But Nietzsche didn't leave us with just diagnosis and critique. He offered a vision of what might come after the last man, what might emerge once we fully metabolize the death of God and embrace the creative freedom it makes possible. This is the Übermensch, often mistranslated as Superman, but better understood as the overhuman, or one who overcomes humanity as it has existed. The Übermensch is not a biological evolution, but a psychological and spiritual one. It represents the human being who no longer needs external authorities to validate their existence, who creates rather than obeys values, who embraces life in its totality rather than fleeing from its painful aspects, who transforms the chaos of existence into meaningful order through creative will. This isn't about dominating others, a grotesque misinterpretation of Nietzsche's philosophy that led to its appropriation by fascism. Rather, it's about mastering yourself, about integrating the fragmented aspects of your nature into a coherent whole, about becoming a law unto yourself, rather than a follower of laws imposed from without. The true freedom that emerges from God's death is not the adolescent freedom of anything goes, a freedom that quickly degenerates into new forms of slavery, to impulse, addiction, or nihilistic despair. It's the mature freedom of self-legislation, self-creation, and self-overcoming. Let me offer you a thought experiment. Imagine that your life will repeat exactly as it is, eternally. Every joy, every pain, every mundane Tuesday, and significant triumph, all of it recurring in precise detail forever. Nietzsche called this the doctrine of eternal recurrence, and he proposed it not as a metaphysical truth, but as an existential test. Could you affirm such a life? Could you say yes to everything that has happened and will happen without wishing to change a single detail? Most of us would recoil from this prospect. We live partially, conditionally, saying yes to some aspects of existence while rejecting others. We cling to what brings pleasure and comfort, while resenting what causes pain or disrupts our plans. We live in perpetual quarrel with reality itself. But what if true freedom, the freedom that becomes possible after God's death, means embracing life unconditionally? What if it means loving fate, what Nietzsche called amor fati, rather than resenting it? What if the highest expression of human freedom is not the power to escape necessity, but the capacity to incorporate all necessity into your self-creation, to transform "it was" into "thus I willed it"? This is not resignation or passive acceptance. It's the active transmutation of all experience, including suffering, into meaning. It's what Nietzsche meant when he wrote, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger." Not that suffering automatically strengthens us, but that we have the capacity to interpret and integrate suffering in ways that expand rather than diminish our vitality. God's death creates the void where this radical freedom becomes possible. Without a cosmic judge validating some experiences while condemning others, without a predetermined plan giving preferential meaning to certain outcomes, we are free to embrace the whole of existence, its beauty and its terror, its pleasure and its pain, as the raw material of our self-creation. But let's be concrete. What does this mean for your life, here and now? It means questioning the values you've inherited rather than assuming their validity. It means asking, whose life am I living? Whose definition of success am I pursuing? Whose version of goodness am I trying to embody? It means recognizing how much of what you call yourself is actually the internalized voice of parents, teachers, religious authorities, social media, advertising, and cultural conditioning. It means distinguishing between what Nietzsche called master morality and slave morality. Master morality emerges from an affirmation of one's own nature and values what enhances life, strength, and growth. Slave morality emerges from resentment toward those with power and values what tames, diminishes, and equalizes. Both exist within you, creating contradictory impulses and judgments. Freedom requires becoming conscious of these competing moral frameworks and choosing which will guide your life. It means practicing what Nietzsche called the revaluation of all values, subjecting every "thou shalt" to scrutiny, asking of each moral command, does this enhance life or diminish it? Does this emerge from strength or weakness? Does this represent an affirmation of existence or a negation of it? It means recognizing that in a world without God, you become responsible not just for your actions, but for the values that guide those actions, for the meaning you create from your experiences, for the person you are becoming through your choices. This responsibility is enormousness, even crushing, but it is also exhilarating, the precondition for authentic selfhood. Consider how we respond to suffering. In a God-centered worldview, suffering must be justified. It must serve some divine purpose, teach some lesson, or represent punishment for sin. But what if suffering needs no justification? What if, instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" a question that assumes some cosmic fairness should prevent your pain, you asked, "How am I responding to what is happening?" This shift, from demanding justification to accepting responsibility for your response, is what becomes possible when God dies. Or consider how we think about morality. Without God as the source of moral law, we can no longer pretend that our moral intuitions reflect some objective cosmic order. Instead, we must recognize them as expressions of our nature, our needs, our particular perspective on life. This doesn't mean anything goes. It means understanding morality as something we create rather than discover, something that emerges from life rather than being imposed upon it from outside. This recognition liberates us from moral absolutism without surrendering us to moral nihilism. It allows us to create values that serve life rather than diminish it, that emerge from health rather than sickness, that express our unique nature rather than suppressing it. It means morality becomes an art form rather than a system of control. But perhaps most importantly, the death of God liberates us from what Nietzsche called otherworldliness, the devaluation of this world in favor of some perfect realm beyond. When heaven disappears, earth can finally be embraced in all its imperfect splendor. When eternal life vanishes, this finite existence gains infinite value. When divine perfection ceases to be our measure, human excellence can be appreciated on its own terms. This is the heart of Nietzsche's philosophy. Not the nihilistic celebration of God's absence, but the heroic task of creating meaning in that absence. Not the destruction of all values, but the creation of life-affirming values. Not freedom from all constraints, but freedom to become who you truly are. The death of God is not the end of your story. It's the beginning. It's the necessary clearing away of inherited authorities that prevented you from authoring your own existence. It's the precondition for what Nietzsche called the great noon, that moment of perfect clarity when the shadow of God no longer obscures the horizon of human possibility. So where does this leave us? With a challenge that few have the courage to accept: to live as if your choices matter even in a universe that assigns them no cosmic significance. To create meaning, knowing it is your creation, rather than your discovery. To give style to your character knowing no eternal standard judges your performance. To love fate without believing fate loves you back. This is what it means to truly inhabit the death of God, not to fall into despair at the universe's indifference, but to recognize that indifference as the precondition for your freedom. Not to lament the absence of cosmic meaning, but to embrace your role as a meaning creator. Not to seek new masters to replace the old God, but to master yourself. We circle back to where we began. You've been living in a prison without walls, never noticing the chains. These chains weren't just religious institutions or explicit beliefs in God. They were the ways God's shadow continued to determine how you judged yourself, what you considered possible, what values guided your life. Even atheists remain imprisoned when they simply reject God while maintaining the psychological and moral framework God's existence once justified. True freedom begins when you recognize these invisible chains, these assumptions about meaning, morality, and purpose that you've never questioned. It accelerates when you accept that in God's absence, you inherit both a terrifying responsibility and an exhilarating opportunity. To create yourself and your values without templates, without guarantees, without external validation. This is Nietzsche's message to you across time. God had to die so that you could truly live, not as a creature made in someone else's image, but as an artist engaged in the greatest creative act, the forging of a self worthy of your brief moment in existence. The death of God was never the end. It was always the beginning, your beginning. The only question that remains is, do you have the courage to walk through the door that is opened before you? Become who you are. This was Nietzsche's imperative, his challenge to all who would listen. Not who you should be according to others, not who you once were, not who would make others comfortable, but who you are in your deepest nature, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be created. The greatest freedom isn't doing whatever you want, it's becoming who you are. And that journey could only begin when God, the ultimate external authority, breathed his last and left the universe in your hands. If you found this journey through Nietzsche's philosophy valuable, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more philosophical explorations. Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to know how Nietzsche's ideas resonate with your own experience of freedom and meaning-making in your life. Until next time, keep questioning, keep creating, keep becoming who you are.